climate change, global warming. Are you scared? Should be. No, you shouldn't be. I'm not. Hell, I'd like to see the world warm up by 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees. I'm not crazy about white Christmases anyway. I hate the winter. I mean, one reason the snowbirds in America go down to Florida and Texas and Arizona is to get away from the cold. And the cold actually kills 20 times more people every year than the heat. About 80,000 die from severe cold, 2,000 die from severe heat. So I'm going to talk about several things today on this, about warming and about CO2. Carbon dioxide. Sounds kind of sinister. But it's just a gas like oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, helium, etc. And CO2 is necessary for me to be here. Wouldn't be here without it. And neither would you. So this whole climate change thing, climate change was changed to climate change from global warming when global warming actually sort of stopped about 20 years ago. Despite the demands of the politicians of 100 countries, and the UN and the third world country known as Al Gore said that it was going to keep going, that the seas were going to rise and flood cities, etc. But it hasn't happened. So they had to find another word for it, another phrase, and they came up with climate change. Well, the Earth has been doing climate change for 4.5 billion years, and it's going to keep on doing it. But the climate changing is organic, and it's something that the Earth just does. So CO2 is, first of all, we don't know that CO2 really causes much warming, despite what they tell you in the big newspapers and what some scientists say. We really don't know how much convection or holding in of heat that CO2 offers. I don't know if you knew this, but CO2 is not even 1% of the atmosphere. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, 21% is oxygen, and about 1% is argon. If you add those numbers together, that's 100%. So those numbers are sort of proximate. So they're kind of close. They leave about 0.5% open for other gases. And one of those trace gases is CO2. There's very, very little of it in the atmosphere, 1/25th of 1%. If you lined up 10,000 dominoes to make a beautiful oak tree, let's say, only 4 of those dominoes out there on a leaf in that giant domino oak tree would actually be CO2. There's very little of it. And so it really doesn't have that much effect on warming. And most of the CO2 put into the atmosphere is done so by the oceans, 42% by the oceans, 28% by decomposition of organic material, 28% by respiration, breathing of animals. So that leaves just about 2 or 3% that's actually man-made CO2. Frankly, I wish we put out 10 times as much, because the plants love it. The Earth is greening now. More, I should say. It's greening more now than it was before. NASA photos, NASA even says this, even though NASA has been part of this whole climate change BS, unfortunately. That's where our tax dollars go. The Earth is getting greener. And it's just that's what happens because plant life loves CO2. It's one reason why greenhouse owners pump a ton of CO2 into their greenhouses. The plants grow better. Tomato vines grow better. Everything grows better with more CO2. CO2 is good, despite the fact that the U.S. EPA called CO2 in 2009 a pollutant. Yes, what I'm breathing right now and what Miss Fern behind me loves so much, the fact that I breathe out 2 pounds of CO2 every day for her, She gives me back oxygen. The EPA called it a pollutant. Well, they did this so that they could regulate businesses, tax businesses, and businesses, of course, have to run those taxes back to us, pass those taxes on back to you and me. But the government gets bigger with climate change laws by the EPA and the federal government. CO2 is not a pollutant. It's actually a requirement for life, for human life, for all animal life. It's a requirement. It's a requirement for the plants on the earth. Right now, the CO2 level is at about 400 parts per million, 4 out of 10,000, tiny bit. And that's just barely enough for the greenery around the earth to live and to thrive to some degree. It really could do much better if that 400 were up to 1,000 or 2,000. A lot better. It'd be a lot greener. My rose bushes that I just planted about 2 months ago would be even bigger. The rose is bigger, probably more colorful, who knows. But CO2 is good. It's not bad. It's a necessity. If CO2 levels around the earth get to below 150 parts per million, greenery starts dying off. Seriously, it would be mass extinction of plant species, trees, grass, fruit trees, vegetables, everything else. I mean, they start dying off at 150. This has happened in the past, in geological past. And we know this. So CO2 is good. It's not a pollutant. The fact, if you drive by a manufacturer who's pumping a bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere, I mean, salute. Say, hey, double it up, man. Triple it up. We need more CO2. So this whole climate change thing is a farce. It's a way for the UN, the United States, and France, other countries to control businesses. That's why it was all concocted. They tried to do it in the late 60s after the Earth had actually cooled between 1940 and 1970. The Earth actually cooled, even though during the war and after the war, and the industrial machine was pumping out major quantities of CO2. So with that extra CO2, the Earth should have warmed, right? Should have continued to warm like it was in the 1800s around Lincoln's time. Should have accelerated, right? No, it didn't. I mean, the lefties have come out and said, well, it's because we pumped so many aerosols into the air and it reflected the sunshine back into space. No. What it is that we don't know what effect CO2 has. And evidently, it's pretty negligible because we were pumping a ton of it out and the Earth wasn't warming between 1940 and 1970. In fact, as you may recall, any of you who are probably a little bit older than me, if you may recall, the New York Times, Washington Post, other newspapers around the world were claiming that CO2 was not a greenhouse gas, it was a cooling gas. Our CO2 pumping in the atmosphere was going to help cause the next ice age. Yeah. So that's not mentioned very often now, that major foobar. So we don't know, frankly, we don't know what effect CO2 has, but it seems to be pretty darn negligible. There's a very little amount of it in the atmosphere. But it seems to me a warmer Earth is good for most people. More than 4 billion people live outside the tropics, endure really harsh winters. The summers can get pretty hot, but I mean, you know, who really is going to mind a little bit more heat in the summer? But more heat in the winter. I mean, I would love it. I hate winter. I'm a skinny boy. I hate winter. I'm also a Texas boy, so I like heat. It's 83 degrees here. I wish it was warmer here in Atlanta, Georgia. So this whole climate change thing is a charade for the left, for people who like big government, including newspapers, because they get to report on big government and get more subscribers. If you want to call it collusion, I guess it's collusion. But the newspapers don't bother to tell you all of these things or to even explore it. And so CO2, we need more CO2, frankly. I think we need double minimum what we've got now. The people who live along seashores are like, no, I don't want the sea to come up anymore. Well, it's not going to come up much. It won't come up 6 inches, 9 inches, 12 inches. I mean, if you bought a piece of property on the coast and 6 or 9 or 12 inches is going to flood your property, I got some oceanfront property in Kansas, I want to sell you. I mean, that's just not, it's not smart. It's stupid if your property is that vulnerable. So I'm not worried about the ice, the polar caps, glaciers, etc. The only ice I like is in my margaritas. So a bunch of ice is chipping off of Antarctica. So what? I mean, I love icebergs. They look pretty. So what? I mean, really, do we care? Really? I mean, to quote my daughter, so what? Thank you, daughter. Anyway, the whole climate change thing is a farce, and we need to stop government's interest in it, because really what they're doing is they're violating the rights of property owners, business owners, to run their own businesses, to expel CO2 if they want to. And that's what all legislation eventually amounts to, is some sort of violation of individual rights. And so let's do it. Let's get some more CO2. Let's get warmer winters, and let's enjoy it. And maybe some of those snowbirds will stay up north. Talk to you later.